So it was about 30 years ago today. I came out of that tube station back there. And I've got to say, it was really hot like today, actually. And I was pretty anxious, a little bit sweaty. Part of that was to do with the temperature. Really hot day. I think it's like 30 degrees today. But a lot of it was to do with anxiety, because just around the corner there, I had a job interview. And it was pretty make or break for me. So I was a child of the 80s, and in 1985, the Amiga computer was released. And it was good, but it took a while to get going. But by 1987, it really had established itself as one of the best video game computers out there, really. And in 1988, a new company called the Bitmap Brothers, they released a new game called Xenon. And Xenon, you know, was pretty good, but it wasn't amazing. But in the same year, they released another game called Speedball. Now that really was special. And that game had next level graphics, next level sound, and that game really put them on the map. A year later, the Bitmaps released another game called Xenon 2, and that really was a leap forward. Had much better graphics, and the sound was amazing because it was actually from a chart hit called Mega Blast by a band called Bomb the Bass. And I think by the end of the 80s, the Bitmaps really established themselves as maybe the leading video game developer in the UK. So by the early 90s, the Bitmaps were really established as one of the best video game developers in the UK, well, in the world really, especially on the Amiga platform. And one day I was looking at a magazine, and I saw an advert in the classified area. And I don't even know why I was reading that, but it said that the Bitmap Brothers were looking for an artist, a 3D artist, and they needed to know how to use 3D Studio. And unbelievably, I've been learning 3D Studio for the last 8 months. So I got together a letter, and I got together a video of the work that I did in college and the work that I've been doing in my spare time. Got that put together and got that sent off to them. And a week later, I got a letter through the post, and I was invited along for a job interview. So as I came around the corner, I could see this large brick building up ahead of me, and there was a big red banner on it, Metropolitan Wharf. And I knew that in a few minutes I would be going inside there to have my interview. And I started to have doubts. You know, I was thinking, my God, do I really have the skills to join this company? You know, by this point they were kind of legendary, and I was just having a crisis of confidence, I suppose. But as I got closer to the door, I could see the doors were open up above. And I just wondered if that was their office. You know, you never know. So I came up to the entrance just here, and I knew that I had to go inside and give my best performance and not fluff it. And well, you know, let's find out next what actually happened. So the building back then was very different from what it actually looks like today. These days, it's actually a very plush, luxurious office building. And you can see that it's got really nice lighting. It's got a nice receptionist desk. You can actually see from the main entrance all the way through to the back, where you can actually see the River Thames flowing by. But in those days, it was actually a brick corridor, and there was no adornment whatsoever. I don't think there were any pictures even, nothing. There was just nothing on the wall. So just a plain brick corridor going back. And I think there were wall sconces with electric lights, but it's been 30 years and it's actually pretty hard to remember. I just remember it being quite dim, quite cool as well. I found the building quite cool, and I assumed that was because the River Thames is flowing behind it, so I assume it's got a kind of cooling system. Even during the summer, the river, which is a little bit cooler than the land, is actually sucking the heat out of the building. So I kept on walking to the back of the corridor, and eventually I came into a pretty big stairwell with a blank wall on the left and in front of me, and then to the right there was a spiral sort of staircase. I say it was spiral, it was actually sort of rectangular. I went up like this, then turned, and then went up like that. So I grabbed onto the red iron handrail and I climbed up the stairs. When I got to the top of the stairs, I found myself on another landing. And in the interview invitation, it said that they were on the first floor. So I assumed that I was, outside the office. On the left-hand side, there was a very large cast iron door, which was a little bit sort of warped. I remember that. I was thinking, well, it's an old building, so that door's probably seen some action over the years. And on the right-hand side, there was another red door as well. So I was like wondering which door it was. But then I gave a quick scan of the door and I could see there was a doorbell. And next to the doorbell was a little sign that said, the Bitmap Brothers. So I thought to myself, okay, this is it. I'm actually at the office. I'd better go in and see what's going to happen to me. But before we get into that, let me give you a little bit of an insight into my situation. If you've watched the my history videos that I started this channel with, I did those videos a while back now to try and give people a little bit of context about me as a person. Where did I come from? And how did I, get to the point today where I'm interested in retro technology? And there's nothing particularly special about my story, but I find it interesting when you gain insight into people rather than just talking about, disk drives and microchips and all that. It's quite nice to actually know people, I think, a little bit better. And in those videos, I talked about my time in college and the fact that I did a graphic design degree back in, I think it was 1990 to 1993. And that course involved doing photography, obviously learning how to do design. There were lots of exercises in typography, and we did some kind of illustration work as well. It's a very broad course, and it was amazing. I really loved that course. It was fantastic. But by the end of that course, I effectively ended up unemployed, as everybody does generally when they finish a degree or any kind of higher education. And it's at that point then that you need to find some work. So the college held a degree show, and part of that degree show is for the people who evaluate the score to actually see the work that you've done, so they can walk around a room and actually see a little mini exhibition of what you've done. But on top of that, they also have an open show where potential employers can come along and actually see, what you've been up to. I was languishing at home. I must admit I was a little bit starving. I didn't have any money for food at that point. So I was sort of raiding the back of the freezer to find food that people had forgotten about. I think actually people had moved out, and there were things in there that were probably from 5 years earlier. And I was digging those out and eating those. There's probably like a woolly mammoth in there somewhere. And if there was, I probably would have eaten it, if I found it. So yeah, I was getting pretty desperate for work. But at the same time, in those days, it was very difficult to find work because there was no internet. It was very, you couldn't just go on the internet and apply to people. You didn't know what work was available. So going along to the local job center was basically useless because I wouldn't find any graphic design work there. It was more down to the networking of the people in college. And I got a job offer, well, an interview anyway, at Cadbury's, which is a very famous chocolate manufacturer over here in the UK. Started, I think, in the 18th century by some Quakers. And that was in an area of Birmingham called Bourneville. I popped along there for the interview, which was amazing. Bourneville literally smells of chocolate as soon as you get off the train. And I went for the interview, and it was actually for Cadbury Schweppes, because they own Schweppes, the drinks company, as well. And yeah, it went pretty well. And I went back home, and I was waiting for, some kind of response. And then I got another telephone call, as I recall, from college. No email. Only they had my telephone number so they could call me. And somebody had also come to the show, a company called ICL, and I was offered to go for an interview for a job in Reading. And I couldn't go there. I didn't have enough money to travel all the way down to Reading for the interview. So what I did was I had a telephone interview, which may sound a little bit strange, but if you think about it, they'd already seen the work which I'd done because they'd attended the show. So they actually knew what I was capable of. And it was more of a case of just chatting to me and finding out what it was like. So I went to work there, and I got on well with the people there. And, one of the provisos of the job, which was amazing, was that I had to learn and use 3D Studio. To give you a bit of background, 3D Studio was a 3D application that was created by Autodesk, which until that point had mainly concentrated on AutoCAD and other computer-aided design products. But a group of people called the Yost Group had put together the prototype of a 3D application, and very early on in its development, it had then got funded by Autodesk and became an Autodesk product. So the reason why it was important to me and many, many people was because it was actually a relatively cheap piece of software. And I think the main competition for it at the time would have been, of course, Silicon Graphics machines with their very expensive software. But these were very expensive machines. You're talking about £15,000 per machine. And then on top of that, you're talking about £15,000 for the software. And that £30,000 in those days was a lot of money. We're talking about pretty much the amount of money that we need to buy an apartment, a flat, which is kind of crazy. So it was outside the budget of most companies and people, especially individuals. So ICL had got a hold of 3D Studio, which was aimed at more the sort of budget market. But despite the fact it was budget, it was pretty capable. It produced some pretty decent looking renders. And one of the really nice things about it was that it was scanline based, and that meant it didn't use ray tracing. And as a result of that, it rendered images really quickly. You know, images could take 1 minute to render a frame. And in those days, that was pretty much unprecedented. So during my college course, I'd been using 3D software on my Amiga. I had an Amiga 1500, which is an Amiga 2000, and I had a 6830 accelerator in it, which meant it was pretty fast. But at the same time, I was dabbling a lot with ray tracing because I found that really fascinating, how you could sort of simulate reflections and so on. So renders on the Amiga were pretty slow. We're talking about 30 minutes a frame, sometimes an hour a frame. And then all of a sudden on 3D Studio, I was getting similar looking renders that were only taking a minute. And that's because it wasn't using ray tracing. And also, of course, don't forget this was the era of the 486. And the 486 was really making big strides in terms of performance. So yeah, you know, I really wanted to work in 3D. So this was a kind of dream job for me. I basically obviously worked on their work during the day. One of the things, for instance, that I produced was an animation that was very similar to the famous Intel Inside advert from back in the 90s. ICL said to me, we want something like that to show at our trade shows, and it would be played on one of their computers. But of course, instead of showing the Intel chips, it would be focused on it actually being an ICL computer. So it would start off outside, showing it that it was an ICL PC, and then would fly inside to show that it had the cool 486. So yeah, that was a pretty interesting thing to work on. But in the weekends, I was also working on my own projects. So a typical Saturday was that I would turn up for work. Nobody would be there. Sometimes some of the other team members might be there. And I would work on work first. You know, I would check a render that I'd done the night before, generally an animation, you know, like say, for instance, the Intel Inside kind of advert, see how that went. If it had gone perfectly well, then I would basically, that was it. I was finished for the day. If it hadn't quite worked out, then I would make some tweaks and get it ready to render again. But then I wouldn't actually kick off a render. I would then use the machine for the rest of the day, or at least until I wanted to leave. And I would practice whatever I wanted to practice. I didn't feel guilty about this because basically everything that I learned in that time was rolled back into my day job when I turned back up on Monday. And let's face it, I was doing work for them on the weekend for free. So I think it was all good, really. But over time, I got better and better at using 3D Studio. It was a very good modeling package in terms of hard surfaces. So what I mean by that is mechanical objects. If you wanted to make, say, for instance, the wheel of a bike or a bicycle itself, the bicycle frame, it was pretty good for stuff like that. Making the saddle would be more difficult because it's more of a sort of organic shape. And when it came to doing models of people or animals, it wasn't so great. On top of that, if you actually wanted to animate, say, a creature, 3D Studio at that point didn't have any sort of skinning tools, so it wasn't so good for that kind of stuff. But over time, I found that I had a really good talent for lighting. I think that came from my college course, being sort of alloyed as well with my general art skills. I was a good illustrator. I had a good understanding of color and on the college course. And earlier course, I'd learned about color theory. So I did some pretty nice looking lighting. I took notice of shadows, which is a big thing, obviously, in photography. So if you looked at other people's work from the time, the thing that you would find was pretty deficient was their lighting wasn't very good. The shadows would be very often missing. And I did everything I could to try and give shadows to my scene and light. And it's the combination of those things that really makes things look solid and realistic. So my images look pretty good. Even though the models were pretty basic, they actually look pretty decent. So after a while at ICL, I was probably one of the few people in the country that had any sort of decent skills in 3D Studio. I'm assuming that many people were using a pirated copy of it. But at ICL, we actually had the legit copy. And another privilege was that I could take these manuals home with me on the weekend. And these were really massive, chunky manuals. So yeah, I would take those home with me in the evenings, read up on how to model in 3D Studio. I couldn't actually do any work at home. I didn't have a PC. I had an Amiga 4000 at home, which was fantastic for gaming. So I was living a pretty cool life for me at that time, playing games in the evening, watching a bit of MTV, and then doing some 3D rendering maybe at home, or as I said, playing games. And then my day job was then doing 3D. So I was really, really immersed in 3D and computers at that point. And it's for that reason that when that job interview that I mentioned earlier turned up in that magazine, I was actually one of the few people in the country that had any skills in 3D Studio. So I thought to myself, I've got some kind of chance at this job. I am not maybe the most experienced 3D modeler, an animator especially. I did have some animations, but they were pretty basic. But I thought, I've got a pretty decent stab of getting this job because I've got at least some skills. I've got a degree in graphic design, so I've got some general skills as well. I was good at illustration. I could draw really well. I could draw in, black and white. I was good at shading, or I could paint. And I had digital skills. So I was really thinking to myself, I was kind of quietly confident that I had some kind of chance at getting this job. So yeah, there I was standing outside that door. The doorbell rung, and I was just waiting for something to happen. And a few seconds later, the door swung open, and a lady popped her head out of the door, and she asked me who I was. I said, Chris Thomas, I'm here for the job interview with Eric. As I understand it, Eric was the person on the letter. And again, in those days, there was no real web internet. I mean, there was the internet and there was the web, but it was very, very nascent. It had only really just come out. So it wasn't like you could go on there and find out like the bio of Eric or the other people who worked at the Bitmap Brothers. So Eric to me was just a name, and I told the lady that and said I was there for the interview, and she invited me in, and she told me that her name was Abby. And she asked me to wait in the entrance area while she went to go and get Eric. So I took a look around, and again, this is 30 years ago, and I'm trying to remember the layout of the office. But what I remember was there was a wall in front of me with a window in it. The wall was a stud wall, made out of wood. And it was then finished with plasterboard, or drywall as they call it in the US. And there was a door there. There was no actual door on it. It was just an open door. And then to the left of me was another door. To straight ahead in this direction, there was a corridor going off in that direction. And it went about 10, 20 meters and then just stopped. There were a couple of doors on the right-hand side. And I looked to the right, and there was a door here looking into a kitchen. So Abby had walked off in that direction. She'd gone through that door. So I assumed, that's where Eric would be. So yeah, I just waited there until Abby turned up, and obviously, I was pretty nervous while she went off and got Eric. So shortly, Abby returned, and she asked me to follow her, and this was it. I was going in for the interview, and yeah, obviously very, very nervous. So I followed Abby closely. I had an art portfolio under my arm, and inside there was my college degree graphic design work. Now, this consisted of the sort of typical coursework which I'd done. As I said earlier, layout, typography, photography. I had some photographs in there. I was actually pretty good at photography, something I really, really enjoyed on the college course, actually. And I also had another copy of the videotape that I'd prepared and sent to Eric for the interview. I'd made a couple of copies of it because I thought, well, I'm going to make one, so I may as well make 3 or 4. And I just took it with me as insurance, just in case something had happened to the tape before I turned up for the interview. So I walked past some people in the office. There was a guy in front of me here, balding, quite young, maybe 31, 32, something like that. There was a large guy to the right of me who gave me a nod as I walked in, quite friendly of him. And then I just walked past these people, and there was a door up ahead of me. I remember there was an aquarium actually to my right as I walked towards that door, and I think that door was Eric's office. So I walked into the office, and I really can't remember at this point if there were more than one person interviewing me. I think there was. I think Eric asked the guy who was balding to come into the room and sit down. And he was introduced to me as Simon, and he sat down. So they introduced themselves. Simon was one of their game developers, game designers, and Eric was one of the founders of the company. And he was the guy who had originally viewed my tape and would be doing the interview that day. So before I carry on, I will explain who the Bitmap Brothers were. Now, I'm not going to explain all of them, because if you actually go online and have a look for the people in the Bitmap Brothers, there's a lot of people, 30 people, something like that altogether. But there were 3 people who actually founded the company. And these were the main people that you would have seen on PR in the mid-80s. Well, from 1988 onwards, I think it was when they had their first game released, Xenon. So there was Steve Kelly, and he was a relatively tall guy, a little bit shorter than myself. He had long hair. He wore glasses. I remember he wore round glasses. And there was something about him, actually, that reminded me of the gentleman from the Chaos Engine. Then there was Mike Montgomery, and he was a more rotund guy, quite big, quite stocky, and he had a balding head. And then there was Eric Matthews, and he was a shorter guy, dark, I think it was black hair, or at least dark brown, no glasses, clean shaven. He had a kind of twinkle in his eye. He seemed to be quite a mischievous person as I sort of sat there. He had a sort of, yes, quite a big energy about him. As I said, came across as being a little bit mischievous. So yeah, Eric was probably one of the first bitmaps that you would have seen if you know the Bitmap Brothers, because if you ever played Xenon, he actually digitized himself to put himself in the sidebar, the side panel of the game. So I didn't know it at the time, but Eric was the more artistic of the 3. I think he'd actually done the bitmap graphics on Xenon, although actually I'm not sure about that, but I think he did. But since that game, he had evolved into more of a sort of production role, more of a producer, and he was a game designer. And he became, I think, the lead game designer at the Bitmap Brothers. So the interview was with Eric, and as I said, I think it was also with a guy called Simon. So Eric was sitting there, and he was behind what was quite a large laptop. It was a Toshiba laptop, which I remember back in those days was quite a high-end machine. And I remember he was quite proud of it. He pointed out to me that he just got it, and he explained to me that the reason why he'd got this laptop was because it had a CD-ROM built in, which was pretty exotic back in the 1990s, the early 90s, 93. And he said that it was quite a high-end laptop, and he had to have it because of the game that they were working on. So that was pretty interesting. So I got the idea that obviously the game that I might be working on might have some kind of CD-ROM thing going on. But anyway, I'd have to see how it went during the interview. So Eric asked me to open up the portfolio. So I opened that up, and I showed him the contents of it that I brought along with me. And I proceeded to pull out the pieces of work. And it was a real mishmash. There were like illustrations in there that I'd done by pen. There were paintings that I'd done actually before I'd even done my degree course. I did some oil painting when I was a teenager, being a little bit precocious, thinking that I could be an oil painter. There was some typography in there, some One of the things we did on the college course, which was quite cool, was we were asked to do caricatures of everybody in the class. Well, not everybody, certain people. And it turned out that I had a pretty good talent for doing that. So I would use elements of a typeface like squiggly brackets and semicolons and things like that, and asterisks. And using just those, you had to do a portrait of somebody, which is pretty cool. So for instance, there was one guy on the course called Rob Patterson. I hope he's not watching. Rob was a bit of a spliffhead, I would say. I kind of characterized him by giving him sort of asterisks for his eyes. So it kind of made him look like he was a bit spaced out. And he actually quite liked that. He found it quite funny. So yeah, there were lots of things like that. There were lots of these bits of artwork on paper, photographs, 3D prints, things like that. My college had a really good printer, so we could actually print out things in full color. And Eric and Simon were, dutifully interested in what I was showing them. And I knew that this wasn't really what they'd invited me there for the interview. At the end of the day, I was there to work on a 3D project, using 3D software. So I knew that, but I thought to myself, well, it's really good to show people that you have a solid grounding in art and design, that you're not just a 3D person. Because in those days, the truth of the matter was, it was actually quite hard to do anything that looked pretty good in 3D. So my college work showed a kind of depth in art and design, and I thought it was good that I actually showed that to them. So once that was all done, Eric asked if we could go through the video that I'd sent in. So he still had it, which was great. So we sat back and the three of us watched the video play out. And of course, I'm sitting there and I'm kind of squirming inside because I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, I know this looks really basic. There wasn't a lot of it. I'd only had 6 months working in 3D Studio. So some of the stuff on the tape was actually stuff that I produced in college using my Amiga. So it was lower resolution because on 3D Studio, because I found that images were taking, let's say, 1 minute to render at, like, say, Amiga resolution, I could now bump it up to Super VGA, like 640 by 480, and still get 4-minute long renders, which was fantastic, So they were relatively high resolution for those days. Sounds very low resolution now that we have, HD and 4K and 8K. But back in the early 90s, 640 by 480 was actually higher resolution than not so much TVs could display, but basically they kind of filled in the normal resolution that a TV would display, sort of standard definition, as it were. So yeah, we watched the video, and then Eric rewound the tape. We're talking about VHS videotape. It's analog, so you have to rewind it back to the beginning, press play again. And this time we went through it again interactively, talking about what each video piece was about. And I explained, about the pieces that I'd done on my college course, why I did them, how I did them, the software that I used to do them with. And then onto, obviously, the 3D Studio stuff. There was the Intel Inside kind of advert, which I talked about earlier. And there was also this animation that I'd done, which was probably sort of the best thing that I did that was most sort of suited towards video games. I'll talk about that in a second. But, I was thinking about this. I was thinking, I suppose one of the reasons why they wanted to go through this stuff with me was maybe I didn't do this stuff. Maybe I'd plagiarized this stuff from somebody else, And I'm sure they really wanted to make sure that if they hired somebody, it wasn't somebody who had just sort of stolen work from somebody else and rocked up and just sort of arrogantly walked in and was trying to blag their way into the job at this company. So I guess one of the things about, going through everything was just to validate that I was the person that did them, which I had, had done all of these things. So that was perfectly fine. Now, the thing I was saying was probably the best thing I'd done at that point. It was this kind of insect character. It was a sort of humanoid, sort of like a humanoid insect. I think it might have had 4 arms, had a weird sort of praying mantis kind of head. And it was in a kind of castle. And I turned on like atmospheric effects. So there was like a foggy effect. And it was jumping through these beams of light. And it was jumping from pillar to pillar and sort of hanging onto the pillar like a kind of ninja, to think of a better word. And he was sort of like jumping from one pillar to the next very agilely. And I remember it being very, very difficult to animate because, so the way the way 3D software worked in those days, and it takes a little bit of explanation for this, there was an original system for doing 3D animation called forward kinematics. And the way that worked was you made a bunch of 3D objects, and then you attach those objects together in the 3D software, and then you could rotate the object. And when you rotate it, so as an example, if I rotated my upper arm, it would rotate my lower arm. And that's what is meant by forward kinematics. It means that whatever you rotate here, whatever's connected to it forwards in the chain of connections gets rotated as well. So if I wanted to, let's say, put my hand on my head, I'd have to do that. I'd have to rotate my upper arm, then I'd have to rotate my hand, and then I'd have to adjust each finger individually. That meant if you wanted to make a character grab onto somebody's arm or grab a can or something like that, it was so difficult. So as I had that insect character jumping through the air, actually having it slow down and stop realistically on each pillar was quite tricky, getting the timing right for that. And then on top of that, actually getting it to grab onto the pillar and then appear to hold on to the pillar was a nightmare. I had to put like cubes where the fingers made contact, and then on every single frame I had to adjust each limb joint by joint to actually make it seem like the hand was staying in the same place. If you've ever done animation in 3D, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's a nightmare. So in those days, if you had a Silicon Graphics workstation, that had better software, it was a more powerful machine, and you had a system called inverse kinematics, which was a complete lifesaver when it comes to animation. So the way inverse kinematics works is you can grab the tip of a finger and pull it, and the actual entire limb will move. So if you wanted to put this hand onto my other hand, you would grab the hand and you would pull it, and it would literally move the hand and keep it there. And you could also lock a hand in a position on a certain time range, and then you could unlock it. So as the hand of the insect character grabbed onto the column, you could lock it there, and then you could move the insect around, and the arm would actually move like it was like a real puppet with an armature in it. So it was much, much easier. So that was the kind of thing that I had to contest with on 3D Studio. I was using forward kinematics, so animation was not easy whatsoever. So looking back, I've got to cut myself some slack. I did a pretty good job. It was just the software that actually made it really, really hard to do something amazing. So the interview moved on, and Eric invited me to come and sit next to him and Simon. Instead of facing against each other, we would sit side by side so we could look at his laptop. And he loaded up a piece of software on his laptop, and he told me that it was a game that they were working on called Zed. And I thought, well, that's a funny name for a game, Zed. I assumed it must be maybe one of those code names, like Star Wars was Blue Harvest. I assumed that for some reason they decided to call the game Zed as a sort of placeholder. So I asked Eric about that, and he said, yes, it was a placeholder, and the game was originally called Zed because they just wanted to have a name, something to call it by. But he said that by this point in the project, they'd thought about different names, but nothing really grabbed them, so they were probably going to stick with Zed. And he thought it was a quirky name, and that was the reason why people would actually remember the game. So it was interesting as a sort of marketing ploy. There was no user interface for the game. It was DOS, and he just basically typed in, z.exe, and it loaded up, and it was just a level of the game. So I'm not sure if you've ever seen Zed. It's a real-time strategy game. And he explained to me that it was a strategy game, but that it was in real time. And I previously played, I think it was Dune 2 on my Amiga. In fact, I think that was one of the first games that I ever played on my Amiga 4000. And I remember that at the time being blown away by the graphics. And on top of that, Dune 2 was a really cool game. And I think from what I remember, Dune 2 kind of created the real-time strategy game. Now, I'm not really sure if Eric had seen that game and copied it in some way. I don't think he had, because he told me that they'd been working on this game Zed for, I think he said it was something crazy like 2 years or 3 years, which means they would have started the game before Dune 2 actually came out, because it actually came out when I started working at ICL, and that was only about 8 months earlier. So obviously it looked like he copied the game, and he was obviously looking a bit annoyed about that because, the Bitmaps were a pretty innovative company. When I saw the game, I was a little bit taken back because I'd never seen the Bitmaps produce a game like that before. But then, looking back, why not? Because they produced 2 shoot-'em-ups, top-down, sort of traditional shoot-'em-ups like you would have seen in the arcade, games like R-Type or 1942, that kind of game. Straight away after that, they did Speedball, which was just a completely different type of game, a future sport. There wasn't any game out there on any computer that I remember which was similar to Speedball. So, very, very innovative. Then they did a sideways platformer, a little bit more traditional, but it had fantastic graphics and had enough, new elements in it that it made it stand out. Then they made, I think it was, an isometric adventure game called Cadaver, which I wasn't that aware of at the time, but when I saw it later, I was actually interested to see that they'd done an isometric adventure game. Then they did the Chaos Engine, which was a top-down shooter, cooperative shooter, a little bit like, I suppose, Ikari Warriors or something like that. But it had a completely different scenario to it. So really, they never did a game that was the same as the last game they produced. So I suppose when I turned up there that day, I should have expected something new. But anyway, I expected maybe like a Chaos Engine or something like that. But there we were. It was a real-time strategy game. And Eric explained to me that they've been working on it for a couple of years. They'd originally started working on the Amiga, but they'd found that because of the fact that it had to move around this really, really massive game area, and they wanted to do it in real time, they found that they needed the CPU horsepower of the PC. They found that the Amiga hardware basically wasn't really cutting it anymore for the game that they were producing. On top of that, I'm not sure quite how this happened, but I think what happened was there was some kind of exploration of whether the game could work in SVGA rather than in VGA. So instead of, say, 320 by 200, it was running in 640-480 or 640-400. And they found that on a PC with a 486, a fast 486, they could actually get real-time scrolling of the map in VGA, which was at the time really, really cool. That was one of the reasons why the PC started to take over, because that CPU had so much horsepower. So they said that, they'd agonized about this because they were big Amiga advocates and they produced a lot of great games on the Amiga, but they just realized that to realize the ambition of the game that they wanted to make, that they had to move production onto the PC. That had resulted in obviously writing the game from scratch on the PC, or rather porting it over, and then getting used to the PC hardware, or rather lack of it. Now, instead of using the Amiga hardware, they were using the raw power of the CPU to do pretty much everything. So that was really interesting to get an insight into the fact that all of that was going on behind the scenes. Then Eric invited me to come outside and have a look at some storyboards. So they had some storyboards on the wall. And storyboards are basically illustrations that are produced for every shot of a movie or an animation, and they are to set out the basic narrative of that piece, whatever it might be. So a classic example of a storyboard would be space, and then a giant spaceship comes overhead, and then an even bigger spaceship comes overhead, firing at the now what looks like a smaller spaceship. That's the opening sequence of Star Wars. So there would have been a few storyboards to tell that story. So we had the storyboards on the wall to tell the story of the introduction of Zed. And he said to me, if I got this job, I would be working on that introduction. I would have to learn 3D Studio as best as I could during whenever time I got it. I would basically have to learn on the job, really. I would very quickly get into making the introduction to the game. So that was very daunting. There I was working on producing pretty basic animations of cameras, and my animation of my insect character jumping from pillar to pillar. And all of a sudden, I was going to be working potentially on a multi-shot introduction that would probably last for like over a minute or something like that. And that was a massive step up from what I've obviously been working on at ICL. But at the same time, the idea was absolutely tantalizing. And that's pretty much where the interview sort of wound down. So Eric said, would I be interested? And I said, yeah, of course. I told him that I thought the game looked really cool and did look really cool. He'd give me a little bit of an insight into the gameplay, moving around the map, selecting the robots, telling them to go to different places. And he showed me that it didn't actually involve building resources, that you would actually capture territories. And then those territories gave you resources, which would then allow you to build tanks from little factories that existed in those territories. So it was actually really cool. It wasn't a copy of Dune, definitely. And as I said, I think its inception actually predated the release of Dune. So yeah, I thought it was really cool that they were doing that. And I said, yeah, definitely, it was a really interesting game. And I would definitely love to work on it. So anyway, Eric took me over to the entrance and he said, thank you for me coming over. And shook my hand and said that they would have a think about what they had seen and they would get back in touch with me. So I, opened the iron door with my portfolio, went down the stairs, being very careful because it was a stone staircase and I was being careful not to slip and fall down it. That would have been ridiculous, can you imagine? Anyway, I got to the bottom of the stairs and I walked back along the corridor towards the archway, towards the daylight, back out into the heat of the day. And I made my way back to the tube station that we started this video with. So that was the interview at the Bitmap Brothers. And all these years later, it really, really sticks with me that I was so lucky to go along there and actually have a chance at working on my dream job, at my dream company. The Bitmap Brothers, I mean, there were other companies out there, producing software on the Amiga, the ST and so on. But they were one of the companies that during my teenage years, my late teenage years, from 17 onwards, they had consistently produced cool games. They had some of the best bitmap graphics of any game on the market. I think they pretty much had the best sound. They had really good sound designers and they had good sort of collaborations with pop music as well. And yeah, their game design was just a different level to everybody else, I personally think. I know that people these days remember Sensible Soccer as being like a thing that stands out. But I've got to say myself, I'm not a massive soccer fan. So for me, Sensible Soccer doesn't have that sort of place in my heart like it does for everybody else. And I played Cannon Fodder and I liked it, but I didn't think it was in the same league as the Bitmap Brothers game. That's just my subjective view. That's just the way I remember it, So yeah, I was actually in with a chance of actually working at the Bitmap Brothers on a game on the PC, working with 3D Studio. I headed over to Paddington train station on the Underground, got back on the train, headed back to Reading, and went back to my bedsit. And I just had to wait and see, was I successful? And we'll find out if I was successful in the next video. So until then, take care, and I'll hopefully see you there.